Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here, a delight to have the opportunity to study the Word with you. Sometimes in the morning when I am having my devotional time, I pick up the Bible that I use, which is a little smaller and a little slimmer than this one, and I look at that and I think, there is all the truth necessary to live this life effectively and well. There. Do we need to know more? Of course we do. God hasn't told us everything we need to know, but He has told us everything we need to know to live effectively and well and walk with Him as Enoch did until He takes us home. I find that exciting. Students sometimes ask me, how did you ever get into Isaiah studies? And I say, well, one October evening as we were eating supper, the telephone rang, and the person on the other end said, this is R.K. Harrison. I am the editor of the New International Commentary on the Old Testament, and I would like you to write a commentary on Isaiah. Excuse me, I'm American. Isaiah, I understand. I said, oh. He said, I want it in 5 years. And I said, that's not possible. He said, well, how long do you need? I said, 10. He said, all right, we'll compromise on 8. Well, I got the first volume in 9 years, and the poor man died waiting for the second volume. But it has been my joy to spend my life in this book. And so I'm delighted to share with you that joy this evening. Isaiah is often called the Prince of the Prophets. And there are several reasons why that might be possible. He very possibly was a member of the royal family. He had easy access to all of the kings, so possibly he was a prince. Sometimes it is suggested, though no, it's because of the lyrical style of writing. It comes through to some degree in English, but in Hebrew, it is really amazing poetry. It is beautifully, beautifully written. But I think the primary reason is because of the sweep of the theology of this book. I sometimes say to students, if somebody came to you and threatened to take away 65 of your biblical books, keep Isaiah. Because there's more New Testament in Isaiah than any other Old Testament book. And of course, there's plenty of Old Testament. But for biblical theology, from creation to the new heaven and the new earth, it's Isaiah. Justice, grace, judgment, hope, it's all there. He is indeed the Prince of the Prophets. His perception of Yahweh is over and over astonishing. It's captured to some degree in the phrase, the Holy One of Israel. Now it's interesting, that phrase occurs 31 times in the Bible. 26 of them in Isaiah. 13 in 1 to 39, 13 in 40 to 66. The Holy One of Israel. We can imagine why that phrase was so priceless to him. That experience in the temple. Holy, holy, holy. So he could never think of Yahweh as anything other than the sovereign. But more than that, the transcendent one. I'll have opportunity to talk with you about it, but holy means other. You will sometimes read in commentaries and elsewhere that it means set apart. That is incorrect. That's based on a wrong etymology of the word kadosh or kadash. It was thought it originally meant to cut. And so cut apart, it doesn't. Nobody's quite sure exactly other than other. Other. And this Yahweh, Isaiah understands, is the only one who is truly other. Transcendent, other, but of Israel. This transcendent one comes from the heights of glory to a small, unimportant, rebellious bunch of people and gives himself to them. The Holy One of Israel. As you know, the standard position today concerning the book of Isaiah is known as multiple authorship. And that's exactly correct. You will hear it sometimes said, well, there was first Isaiah, there was second Isaiah, there was third Isaiah. No. There was first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th. This book, according to that theory, was written by a committee. I love to ask students, when was the last time you saw a great literary masterpiece written by a committee? No. The thought is that Isaiah ben Amoz wrote maybe 5 or 6 of the chapters. And then his followers added, subtracted, multiplied for another 400 years. According to the theory, some parts of the book of Isaiah were written in 300 BC. And thus you have, with one exception, critical scholars producing in the last 125 years a commentary on 1 to 12, a commentary on 13 to 39, etc. Would we do that to War and Peace? Can you interpret a book that now exists in pieces? I don't think so. There is no mention of any other author. None. There is the strong argument in the latter part of the book based on prediction. This stuff was predicted many years ago, and that proves Yahweh is God. But if it wasn't predicted, finally, we have no evidence, none, that the book ever existed in any form but the one we have here. The Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah, dated now to about 175 BC, the 39th chapter, what we call the chapter, there are no chapters in it, of course, but the last lines of what is now chapter 39 are 2 lines from the bottom of a column. It's written in columns. Chapter 39 ends 2 lines from the bottom. If anyone had any sense that second Isaiah begins with 40, wouldn't they have left a little space there and started chapter 40 on the next column? They didn't. Chapter 40 goes straight on with 2 lines and up onto the next column. I say we have no evidence whatsoever of the book having existed in parts. What that means then is that proper interpretation of the book ought to take it as a whole. We ought to look at it in the way in which, if it was edited, the last editors put it together. They wanted us to read it in this way. I don't think that was an accident. So, what do we see then? The book itself was written between 739 and 700 BC, 40-year period. Isaiah, tradition says, lived longer than that. And I have wondered if perhaps chapters 40 to 66 were written later. I'll talk about that later. But it is written to people in 3 different historic settings. First of all is the crisis of Samaria's fall and the subsequent Assyrian threat, which occurred between 739 and 700. And that's chapters 6 through 39. This projection shows Assyria at its greatest extent. During Isaiah's time, they had not yet captured Egypt. And so they are pressing down the Levantine coast toward Egypt, and Israel and Judah are right in the way. And so we have that crisis when finally Samaria is taken and the border of Assyria is 6 miles north of Jerusalem. The second crisis is the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile, which occurred between 586 and 539 BC. This is chapters 40 to 66. The third crisis, and that's Babylon, basically the same area that Assyria had held. Babylon took it away from them with the help of the Medes and held it for only 70 years. Interesting that. The third crisis is the crisis of the return. We have come back from exile. We are not the rulers of the world. We don't have an independent king. Jerusalem is not rich. Is Yahweh still God? Dates a little more fuzzy here. The return is not fuzzy, it's 539, but really it's almost 100 years until Judah finally gets her feet back under her in terms of faith in Yahweh. Now the question that has to be asked is, why write to future people? This is the big sticking point. Other prophets talk about people in the future. This one talks to people in the future. And more than anything else, that has given rise to the theory of a second Isaiah. Now, I have to say that part of the problem there is a refusal to admit the possibility of prophetic prediction. What? Isaiah knows what is going to happen 150 years in the future and writes to them? Give me a break. Well, that seems to be what the book wants us to think. Why would he do that? I think the answer is the terrible impact of the Israelite exile. I think we too easily think of, oh yeah, there's Judah. Yeah, they were the faithful ones. And then there's rotten Israel. And they, of course, they didn't have one good king in the whole bunch. They were idolaters from the outset. No. Judah and Israel were closely intertwined politically, especially from Jehoshaphat on. And it's pretty clear that they were intertwined in other ways as well, as Ezekiel talks about the older sister and the younger sister. Here is the nation of Israel. and 3/4 of it is torn away in Isaiah's lifetime, in his experience. And so he understood the terrible questions this raised about, is Yahweh sovereign? Was he unable to hold on to his people? Is he faithful? Does he keep his promises? Does he care? Isaiah knew all of that firsthand experience. And he also knows that Judah is not going to escape. And so I think he writes, and I'm not quite alone in this, he writes to those people out there, I know what's going to happen to you, and I know what questions you're going to be asking, and I want you to be forearmed against them. I like to think of some people coming in from the fields down in southern Babylon after a long, hard day, and someone lighting a lamp, and somebody pulls out a scroll that was smuggled out and saying, here's what Isaiah has to say to us. Why is it that the Jewish people survived the exile? We know of no other people who did. The whole purpose of the exile is to destroy these captive people's culture and religion and language so that they'll be part of the empire. But these people didn't. I wonder why not. I'll probably comment on this later next week. But one of the interesting things is there's almost no historical data in Isaiah about the exile and the return. Commentators wrestle with this. In the other prophets, you have a lot of data about the time period when the prophecies There's only one piece of data, the name of the deliverer, Cyrus. I don't think Isaiah knew the historical data about the exile. He knew an exile was coming, just like had happened to Israel. I want you to be ready. So, we're going to look at the whole book. And we're going to look at the book as a unit. Alan mentioned the inductive approach. Induction seeks not to impose outside principles on the data you're looking at. You don't say, okay, we know that Isaiah was written by multiple authors. Therefore, we will interpret it according to my understanding of what the multiple author said. That's deduction. You have assumed an outside principle and imposed it on the material. Induction seeks to look at the material as it stands and say, how is that functioning? How is that working? What principles from within it can we derive concerning it? An inductive approach. Sitting down with your Bible and saying, okay, how does that sentence relate to that sentence? So forth. It attempts, first of all, to look at the book as a whole, and that's what we're going to do this evening. And then at the parts. You see, if you start with the parts, you may very well draw some wrong conclusions that you will then force on the larger thing. So if you only look at the tail of the fish, you may say, okay, that's the head. Okay. And you look at the rest of the fish. Oh, how interesting that this thing was up there on No, you look at the whole fish first. And so it is with inductive Bible study. You look at the whole from there to the parts. And then you attempt to see the relationships among these parts. How do they work together? You're going from the larger to the smaller, to the smaller, to the smallest. Then working back up in the light of that. That sounds complicated. It's not that complicated. Here are some examples of literary relationships that are so important when you are looking at the book. Recurrence, repetition. I don't know whether you've noticed this or not, but repetition is the soul of education. Have I told you this before? Repetition is the soul of education. Did you understand? Repetition is the soul of education. When we're trying to make a point, we repeat ourselves. So if we find recurrence, repetition, we say, that must be significant. The writer must want me to think about that in some detail. The technical terms, repetition would be when the same term is being repeated. Holy One of Israel, Holy One of Israel, Holy One of Israel. Recurrence is when similar ideas are being repeated. Then comes causation. Because you have sinned, therefore you will go into captivity. Cause, effect. Or you can do it the other way around and call it substantiation. You will go into captivity because you have sinned. Cause and effect. Continuity is another kind of recurrence where you've got broad ideas that are being stated again and again, perhaps in slightly different ways, but you're basically making the same point throughout. That's easily confused with the next one, continuation. And all the time I work with students on this one. Continuation is development. Point 1 leads to point 2, leads to point 3, leads to point 4, leads to point 5. Now sometimes that can be with a concluding climax, some sort of a bang with which the development ends. Contrast. Not this, but that. Again, what we're doing here is we're saying, oh, look, this part of the book is stated this way, and this part of the book is stated in the opposite way. There's a contrast here. This, but that. Pivot. Contrast. And here in the middle is a section that explains, this is how we got from there to here. Pivot. And finally, there's some more, but I'm not going to burden you with more. Problem solution. Something is wrong here. Something is not working here. Why isn't it working? Solution. We're going to see an example of that. We're going to see examples of most of these as we look at the book. So, the inductive approach, more than almost anything else, depends on observation. You cannot interpret what you did not see. I don't know how many times in devotional reading I look at a verse and say, oh my goodness, how many hundred times have I read that and I never saw that? Observation. Sometimes it's referred to as close reading. Looking with great care at what is actually being said. I often say to students, the most important part of biblical interpretation is read the rest of the verse. Observation. Then comes interpretation, questions about what you have observed. I saw a contrast in my initial observation. What exactly is contrasted? What's that and what's this? And how are they different? It's sometimes called questions of definition. What is it that I saw? What exactly is the cause and what exactly is the effect? Sin is the cause and the effect is exile? That leads to the next set of questions. Why? Why in the biblical world does sin lead to exile? Couldn't it have led to something else? Definition, rational, and then finally implication. I like to say what, why, and so what. What does this imply? Here's where you're beginning to think about the theological implications here. In what sense does my sin lead me from my homeland to being an alien? Why does sin result in alienation? Interpretive questions. Definition, rational, implications. Now, may well be after we're done this evening, Alan may correct me on all these, and that's all right. He can be wrong. Correlation. How does this insight appear elsewhere in the book? In the section? Prophets? In the Testament? In the Bible? Is this a one-off? Or in fact, is this supported in various ways by other portions of Scripture? That will lead to evaluation. Okay, this is a one-off. You know, Paul says, if Jesus be not raised, why are some baptized for the dead? Out of which the Mormons get baptism for the dead. I think that's a pretty big triangle to build on its point. No, I don't think this passage is one that has universal implications. Other passages, I think sin leads to exile. I think that can be supported all over the place. Evaluation. And finally, application. What am I going to do with this? How am I going to teach it to others? That's induction. And I think Alan would say that this discovery, which neither of us discovered, we were taught it, changed his life. It certainly changed mine. Changed the way I read the Bible ever since. Okay. Let's talk then about the book, the structure of the book. It is remarkably like that of the Bible. 66 chapters, 66 books. Did the folks who put chapters into the Bible do that on purpose? Wouldn't surprise me. But, How many main divisions in the Bible? 2. How many books in the second division? 27. How many books in the first division? 39. 39 chapters, 27 chapters. This begins to get eerie, but it gets worse. How about the content of the 2 divisions? First 39 chapters of Isaiah are about justice and judgment. Second 27 chapters of Isaiah are about grace and hope. Old Testament, New Testament? That'll be one of my questions when I get to heaven. As for the lower levels, the sections, there is general agreement. 3 main parts. The second part that I've talked about can be divided into 2. 1 to 39, 40 to 55, 56 to 66. Left, right, center, virtually all commentators will agree on this. The agreement will go farther than that, to the subsections. There'll be agreement that 1 to 5 go together, chapter 6. Now, some people, like me, want to put 6 with 1 to 5. Others want to put it with 7 to 12. We'll talk about that tomorrow, I believe. No, in the second lecture. 7 to 12, yeah. 13 to 23, 24 to 27, 28 to 35, 36 to 39. Pretty general agreement. 40 to 55, 40 to 48, 49 to 55, 56 to 66, 56 to 59, 60 to 62, 63 to 66. General agreement on these sections. But apart from that, there's really only one place where the commentators will agree, and that is that chapters 1 to 5 are probably constructed as the introduction to the book. But beyond that, there's little agreement. So I want to talk with you now about an inductive survey of the book. Here's what it looks like. Throughout the book, there is a recurrence of contrast between judgment and hope. Now, these people to whom Isaiah is writing, they think that hope is to escape judgment. And Isaiah says, for you people, the only hope is through judgment. It is through the fires of judgment that you can possibly survive. Without the fires of judgment, you will not survive. So running through the book, this recurrence of contrast, judgment versus hope, but in a real sense, hope through judgment. Chapters 1 to 39, the general focus is upon judgment. Chapters 40 to 66, the general focus is on hope. That then raises a question which we'll seek to answer. Are chapters 36 to 39 pivotal? Do they in some way explain to us how we move from a major emphasis on judgment to a major emphasis on hope? We want to think about that. Chapters 1 through 5, and I believe 6, are preparation and introduction. And the rest of the book is a realization of that preparation. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. 7 to 39, you see what we're doing? We're moving down, trying to see how these relationships are working, holding the material together. Continuation. Are we going to trust God, Ahaz? No. Well, if you don't, the nations are going to destroy you. Don't trust the nations. Trust the king. Hezekiah, let's take the test again. Will you trust Yahweh? Yeah. Oh, Yahweh can be trusted, can't he? Continuation, development to in some sense, a climax. Now you also notice there inclusio. I'll say more about this as we get to chapters 36 to 39, but many commentators will call chapters 36 to 39 a historical appendix. To which I say, ay, ay, ay. No. 7 to 12. Will you trust God? No. 36 to 39. Will you trust God? Yes. And in between, some lessons. I'll say more about that, a lot more about it. But inclusio is the idea of envelope. What comes between these points is bookended by these sections. (40 to 55), we see the repetition of servant occurring over and over and over again. And we'll want to think about that. Here is continuation with climax. Chapter 55 ends with a beautiful benediction. The mountains and the hills will break forth into song. The trees will clap their hands. We'll go out with singing. You sort of hear the organ coming in with the postlude. But the book isn't done. But this section is finished, and it's finished with that climactic benediction. Finally comes 56 to 66. This is chiasm. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about that in the last lecture, but it's the idea of a pyramid. You start here with the first section, and you work up to this pyramid. Then this section repeats this one. This section repeats that one. So A, B, C, B, A. That's chiasm. What that does is it highlights the central point without forgetting the point where you started. We'll talk about it. In chapters 1 through 5, we have interchange. That is, back and forth. A, B, A, B, A, B. You make one point, then you make the other one. You make the first point again. You make the second point again. Interchange. We also have in 1 to 6, problem and solution. We'll talk about that. 7 to 12, continuity. That is, same general ideas being repeated. Will you trust God? Will you trust God? Will you trust God? What happens if you won't? What happens if you will? Over and over again. 13 to 35, continuity. Again, we're going to talk about all this. Contrast in 39 to 36 to 39. Hezekiah starts out so well. Yes, I'll trust the Lord. But then he drops the ball. What happened? 40 to 48, continuity. God is superior to the Babylonian idols. God is superior to the Babylonian idols. Over and over again. 49 to 55, you're going somewhere. You start with anticipation. God is going to deliver us. And you end with, God has delivered us. How? Okay. Let me back up there a minute. I was going to give you a chance for questions. We need to stop. This is the last slide. I said a moment ago that servant shows up very prominently in 40 to 55. And as I thought about that, I began to think, I wonder if that emphasis is supposed to control how we read the rest of the book. You say, got any examples of that? Yeah, I do have. How do we read the Old Testament? In the light of the Messiah. Doesn't mean we read Jesus back into the Old Testament, but it means that as we read the Old Testament, we have an eye constantly on, where is this taking us? What is this about? How does that point to the cross? So, in that light, I think the book of Isaiah is about servanthood. In 1 to 6, we have the call to servanthood. And it ends with Isaiah's call in chapter 6, and that's going to be very important. Then we have the basis of servanthood. Chapters 7 to 39 are all about trust. You are never going to serve somebody that you cannot trust. That's been the problem from the beginning. That's where Satan attacked. It was his opening attack. You can't trust God. He's not for you. He's not on your side. He lied. You're not going to drop dead. And the rest of Genesis is rebuilding God's trust in the minds of his people. Trust, the basis of servanthood. But what's going to motivate us to trust him? Okay, we believe it. Okay, it's possible. But what will make us do it? Grace. And when he has motivated us to trust him and made it possible for us to live as his servants, what's the character of a servant? Righteousness. So, 1 to 6, problem and solution. These people aren't God's servants. How can they become God's servants? If they have the same experience that I had. Rebel Israel can become servant Israel. I won't trust God. I'll trust the nations, but I won't trust God. And yet, at the end, the Messiah is promised. We'll want to talk about that. 13 to 35, you failed the test, so we're going to have to go back to the textbook. Lessons in trust. The nations are judged in 13 to 23. The judge of the nations, 24 to 27. Wait for the king, 28 to 35. And now we'll take the test again. You get to sit the examination again, Hezekiah. Will you trust God? Yes. But our hope is not in Hezekiah. What's the motive for serving God? Grace. These people are in exile, and God calls them his chosen servants. Wait a minute. The means. How are sinful people going to be servants of the holy God? And the answer is the servant. You're going to be a light to the nations. How? You're going to be divinely enabled. That's how. No. So, as I mentioned before, we have a recurring contrast. Judgment, 7 to 39. Hope, 40 to 66. But both those elements appear in both parts. And finally, the Holy One of Israel unites the whole thing. He is, in 1 to 39, the sovereign of the nations. And in 40 to 66, the Savior of the world.